His wife fed his daughter from the dog's bowl. Then a lawyer knocked. The little girl's name was Naomi. She was 7 years old. She had her mother's big brown eyes, her mother's dimples, and her mother's way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. She loved drawing butterflies in her notebook, and she always saved the last bite of anything sweet, a cookie, a piece of mango, a square of chocolate, because her mother once told her that saving the best for last means you're someone who knows how to wait for good things. Her mother's name was Deborah, and Deborah was gone. But we are not starting there. We are starting on a Tuesday night in October, in a house that used to be full of love, in a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the cinnamon candles Deborah used to burn. Because that is where it happened. That is where, if you had been standing in the doorway, you would have seen something that would have turned your stomach and broken your heart at the same time. The kitchen light was on. The rest of the house was dark. Naomi was on her knees on the cold tile floor. Her small hands were pressed flat against the ground the way a child kneels when they are trying not to fall. In front of her was a ceramic bowl, brown, chipped at the edge, with a name scratched into the side in faded letters. Rex, the family dog who had died 2 years ago. The bowl that should have been thrown in the trash. Inside the bowl was cold rice. Plain. No butter. No seasoning. Leftovers from 3 nights ago that had started to smell sour at the edges. Naomi was crying without making any sound. That is the worst kind of crying, the kind a child learns when they have figured out that making noise only makes things worse. Her small shoulders shook. Her tears dropped one by one into the rice, and she stared at them like she was trying to decide if she was hungry enough. She was. She hadn't eaten since the small cup of cereal that morning, and even that had been half a cup because Leah, her father's new wife, the woman who wore expensive perfume and smiled like a magazine cover whenever Naomi's father was in the room, had said, without looking up from her phone, "You eat too much for your size." 3 feet away, Leah sat at the dining table. Full plate of pasta in front of her. Glass of red wine catching the light. A show playing softly on her laptop. She didn't look at Naomi once. She just twirled her fork slowly, the way a woman does when she has all the time in the world and not a single thing on her conscience. "Eat," Leah had said when she placed the bowl on the floor. "And if you spill 1 grain of that rice, you're cleaning this entire kitchen with a toothbrush." Naomi ate. From the dog's bowl. On her knees. In the kitchen of her own home. The home her mother had chosen, had painted, had filled with cinnamon candles and butterfly drawings and Sunday morning gospel music. And Leah sipped her wine. "Now, before you hear how this ends, and it does end powerfully, the way all things built on cruelty eventually end, you need to understand how a good man let this happen inside his own walls without knowing. Because Solomon was a good man. He was. And this story is as much about what love blinds us to as it is about what happens when the blind finally see. Solomon Adeyemi was 38 years old when his wife Deborah was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. He was the kind of man people describe the same way every time, solid. Not flashy. Not loud. A civil engineer from Lagos who had built a life in Houston, Texas through the kind of patient, unglamorous hard work that never makes the news but holds the world together. He drove a 5-year-old truck. He coached Naomi's Saturday morning soccer team. He was the one in the neighborhood who helped elderly Mrs. Patricia carry her groceries every Thursday without being asked. He and Deborah had been together since they were 24. They met at a church picnic in Houston. She dropped a plate of jollof rice, and he caught it before it hit the ground. And she laughed so hard she had to sit down, and he sat down beside her, and they talked for 4 hours and forgot to eat. That was the beginning. That was how it always is with the loves that matter. They start with something small, something almost missed, and then they become the whole world. Deborah was a primary school teacher. She loved her students the way some people love their own children, with that fierce, personal, takes-it-home-with her kind of love. She stayed late to call parents. She spent her own money on school supplies. She knew every child's favorite color, and every child's home situation, and every child's dream. Her classroom walls were covered in the drawings her students made her, and in the middle of all of them, she had taped a small handwritten sign that said, "Every child deserves to feel like the most important person in the room." Naomi was the daughter of that woman, which meant Naomi had been raised with more tenderness and intention than most adults ever experience in a lifetime. Then Deborah got sick. It started with pain that the first doctor called stress, then a second doctor called muscle strain, then a third doctor, on a cold Wednesday morning in February, looked at the scan results, and went very quiet before he spoke. Solomon was holding Deborah's hand when they heard the words. He held it so tightly she had to whisper, "Soul." "My fingers." And he loosened his grip and said sorry, and she said, "Don't apologize, keep holding it." And he did, and they sat in that cold white room, and the doctor kept talking and Solomon heard none of it, because all he could hear was the sound of the life he had built with this woman beginning to crack underneath him. Deborah fought. That is not a figure of speech. She actually physically, spiritually fought. She went through chemotherapy with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, showing up, doing the hard thing, refusing to let Naomi see her fall apart even on the days she could barely lift her head from the pillow. She made Solomon promise to keep Naomi's routines the same. School on time. Soccer on Saturdays. Church on Sundays. "She needs to feel like the ground is still solid," Deborah said one night, her voice thin but certain. "Even when it isn't." She lasted 19 months from diagnosis. Naomi was 6 years old when her mother died. She was wearing a yellow dress that day because Deborah had once told her yellow was the color of things that keep going: sunflowers, school buses, morning light. Naomi had chosen it herself that morning without anyone telling her to. Some things children know without being taught. Solomon buried his wife on a Thursday. He stood at that grave long after everyone else had gone to the reception at his sister's house. And Naomi stood beside him and held his hand and didn't say anything because she understood at 6 years old that some silences are not meant to be filled. For the next year, Solomon moved through life like a man walking through water. He went to work. He came home. He cooked what he could, which was not much. He helped Naomi with homework in a voice that had lost its warmth. He read her bedtime stories, and she would look up at him with those enormous eyes, Deborah's eyes. And sometimes he would have to stop mid-sentence and clear his throat, and she would reach up and pat his cheek the way her mother used to and say, "It's okay, Daddy. I'm okay." She was not okay, but she was protecting him. At 6 years old, this child was protecting her father from the weight of her own grief. That is what Deborah had raised. Into that quiet, broken, unguarded house, Leah arrived. Her full name was Leah Okonkwo, and she was beautiful in the way that demands immediate attention. Tall, with high cheekbones and a laugh that filled rooms and a way of leaning toward you when you spoke that made you feel like the only person on earth. She was 34. She worked, she said, as a consultant for a hospitality firm. She had grown up in Abuja, she said, studied in London, she said, came to Houston 3 years ago for work. She said a lot of things. She said them smoothly and completely, and with the kind of easy detail that makes you never think to check. Solomon met her at a business dinner 18 months after Deborah died. He was not looking. He hadn't looked at another woman since the diagnosis. He was there only because his colleague Marcus had begged him to come, said he needed to get out of the house, said Deborah herself would have told him to go. Solomon had stood at the edge of that dinner in a suit that needed pressing, holding a glass of water he hadn't drunk, thinking about all the things he still needed to do. Naomi's school fees, the leaking pipe in the second bathroom, the grief counselor he kept meaning to call. Leah found him there. She said later that she noticed him because of how still he was. Every other man in that room was performing, she told him on their second date. You were just standing there being real. That's rare. He had looked at her then with something cautious and half awake in his eyes, and she had looked back with everything open and warm and available. And that was how it started. She was patient with him. She never pushed. She asked about Deborah early, not with the tiptoeing discomfort that most people brought to that subject, but directly, warmly, like a woman who understood that grief was not something to step around, but something to acknowledge. Tell me about her, Leah said one evening over dinner, and Solomon had looked up surprised, and Leah had said, I want to know who she was. She's part of you. He told her. He talked about Deborah for 2 hours that night, the jollof rice and the church picnic and the way she stayed late for her students and the yellow dress and the Sunday morning gospel music and the cinnamon candles. He talked until his voice went rough and Leah reached across the table and put her hand over his and said nothing. Just stayed. He was careful about Naomi. He waited 6 months before introducing them. He had long conversations with his sister Ruth about whether it was too soon, whether it was right, whether Naomi was ready. Ruth had her doubts. She said it quietly, but she said it. And Solomon heard her, but he was lonely in a way that had no bottom to it, and Leah was warm, and Naomi deserved a mother figure. And he told himself these things until they felt like reasons. The day he introduced them, Leah brought Naomi a stuffed rabbit wrapped in pink paper. She crouched down to Naomi's level. She was wearing heels and she crouched anyway, which took effort, and Solomon noticed, and she smiled and said, "Your daddy told me you love animals. This one's been waiting to meet you." Naomi looked at the rabbit. Then she looked at Leah for a long moment with those big, still eyes. Then she took the rabbit and held it against her chest and said, "Thank you." That night, after Solomon tucked Naomi in, she said, "Daddy, she smells like flowers." Then after a pause, "Mama smelled like cinnamon." Then she turned over and closed her eyes. Solomon stood in the doorway and didn't know what to do with what he'd just heard. So he told himself it was fine. Children adjust. This is what moving forward looks like. They were married 8 months later. Small ceremony. Naomi wore a white dress and held a tiny bouquet and stood very straight and very still beside her father like a small soldier. She didn't cry. She didn't smile much either. But she stood there because her father had asked her to, and she loved her father above everything. The first months were careful. Leah cooked. She kept the house spotless. She picked Naomi up from school when Solomon was working late. She was everything a watching I would call a devoted stepmother. And Solomon watched, and he saw devotion, and he believed what he saw because he wanted to believe it. Because the alternative, that he had brought the wrong person into his daughter's life, was a thought he could not afford to have and still function. But there were small things. Small enough to explain away. Leah commenting that Naomi was too emotional for her age. Leah saying that Naomi needed more discipline, and that Deborah had spoiled her. The way Leah's voice changed, just slightly, just at the edges, when Solomon wasn't in the room. The way Naomi had started coming home from school quieter. The way she had stopped drawing butterflies. Solomon noticed the butterflies. He told himself it was grief. Still adjusting. Give it time. He didn't know that the moment his car turned the corner at the end of their street and disappeared, the woman he had married became someone else entirely. He didn't know about the dog's bowl. He didn't know about the cold rice. He didn't know that his daughter, the daughter of Deborah, who had taught a classroom full of children that every single one of them deserved to feel like the most important person in the room, was eating on her knees on a cold kitchen floor while her stepmother watched a show 3 feet away and sipped red wine. But someone else knew. And that someone had been watching and writing and waiting and praying for the day they could do something about it. That day was coming. And when it came, it would arrive not with shouting or fighting or the kind of dramatic confrontation you might expect. It would arrive in the form of a knock on the front door. A man in a dark suit. A briefcase. And documents that would prove, line by line and page by page, that Leah Okonkwo had made one catastrophic mistake. She had wronged a child who was already protected. Her name was Martha. Not a dramatic name. Not the name of someone you'd expect to change a little girl's life. Martha Eschen was 51 years old, short, with thick reading glasses. She was always pushing up her nose and a habit of humming old hymns under her breath while she worked. She had been cleaning houses for 23 years. She was the kind of woman that rich people look through like glass. Present enough to be useful, invisible enough to be forgotten. Leah had hired her 6 months after the wedding. Not because Martha came recommended, not because Leah had checked her references or sat down with her properly, but because Martha charged less than the other options and Leah liked saving money on things she considered beneath her attention. That was Leah's first mistake. Martha noticed everything. She noticed the way Naomi flinched, just slightly, just at the shoulders, whenever Leah walked into a room. The way a 7-year-old child learns to make herself smaller than she already is, pulling her elbows in, tucking her feet under her chair, breathing carefully like she was trying to take up less air. Martha had raised 3 children of her own. She knew what a happy child looked like. She knew what a frightened one looked like. And Naomi, behind those enormous brown eyes, was frightened in a way that had settled deep into her bones the way cold settles into an old house. But Martha was careful. She needed this job. She had a son in his 2nd year of university, and the fees were not going to pay themselves. She could not afford to accuse a woman like Leah, polished, confident, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to make someone look like a liar, without something solid in her hands. So Martha watched. And Martha waited. And Martha prayed every night before she slept that God would show her the right moment. The right moment came on a Wednesday evening in November. Solomon was in Dallas for 4 days. A bridge construction project that had been in planning for 2 years and finally broke ground. He had kissed Naomi on the forehead that morning and said, "Be good, my love. Daddy will be back Friday." Naomi had held on to his sleeve for just a second longer than usual. Just 1 second. Solomon had gently loosened her grip and smiled and walked to the car and driven away. He didn't see the second. Martha did. That evening, Martha was finishing up the laundry in the back hallway when she heard Leah's voice in the kitchen. That voice, the one with no warmth in it, the one that only came out when Solomon was gone. Low and flat and final, like a door closing. "Come here." Martha set the folded towels down slowly. She moved to the doorway without making a sound. What she saw stopped every thought in her head. Naomi was on the kitchen floor. On her knees. In front of that bowl. Martha had seen that bowl before, had even almost thrown it away once during a deep clean before Leah sharply told her to leave it. And inside the bowl was something pale and cold and sad. Leftover rice. The kind that has gone slightly hard at the edges. Naomi was not crying loudly. She was doing that silent cry that Martha recognized immediately, and that broke something open inside her chest, because that kind of crying is learned. Nobody is born crying that quietly. A child learns it because they have discovered that loud tears bring punishment and silent ones at least bring peace. Leah was at the dining table. Full plate. Wine glass. Completely unbothered. She was scrolling her phone with one hand and eating with the other, and she did not look at Naomi once. Not once. Like the child wasn't even there. Like she was furniture. Like she was less than furniture, because Leah treated the furniture carefully. Martha pressed her hand over her mouth. She wanted to walk in there. Every bone in her body wanted to walk in there and pick Naomi up off that floor and wrap her in her arms and tell her that none of this was her fault, that her mother would be horrified, that she was loved and precious and worth infinitely more than what this woman was doing to her. She wanted to slam that bowl against the wall. She wanted to say things to Leah Okonkwo that she had never said aloud to another human being in 51 years of living. She didn't. She stood there and breathed and made herself think clearly. Because she knew Leah. She had watched this woman operate for months now. Leah was smart in the way that dangerous people are smart. She knew exactly how much to show and exactly when to show it. If Martha walked in there without evidence and made an accusation, Leah would be calm and smooth and completely convincing. She would say Martha had misunderstood the situation. She would say Naomi was being disciplined. She would say Martha was a troubled, nosy employee with an imagination problem. And then she would fire Martha, and there would be nobody left in that house to watch over this child. So Martha made a different choice. She went back to the laundry room. She sat on the edge of the small stool she used when she was tired, and she opened the notes app on her phone. The same phone her son had helped her set up at Christmas, and she began to type. Date. Time. What she saw. What Naomi was eating. What the bowl looked like. Where Leah was sitting. What Leah said. Every word. Over the next 3 weeks, Martha documented 11 incidents. 11 times she wrote down what she witnessed. And those were only the things she personally saw. She photographed the bowl twice when Leah wasn't home, the chipped ceramic edge, the name Rex still faintly visible in the glaze. She photographed Naomi's lunch bag one morning after Leah packed it, opening the zipper carefully and looking inside. Empty. Just an empty bag and a half-filled water bottle. She zipped it back up exactly as it was and said nothing and stood in the hallway as Naomi walked out the front door to the school bus with that empty bag on her back, and something cracked a little further inside Martha's chest. She also noticed the bruises. Small ones. On Naomi's upper arms, the kind that come from fingers gripping too hard. The first time Martha saw them, she was helping Naomi change into her pajamas one evening when Leah had gone out. Solomon had asked Martha to stay late that night. Naomi pulled her shirt over her head, and Martha saw 4 small dark ovals on her left arm, and went completely still. Baby, Martha said, keeping her voice level because she could feel Naomi watching her reaction. Where did you get these marks? Naomi pulled her pajama top on quickly. I bumped into the door, she said. The way she said it, fast, practiced, automatic, told Martha everything she needed to know. That was not a child remembering what happened. That was a child reciting what she had been told to say. Martha tucked her in that night and sat on the edge of the bed a little longer than usual. Naomi lay very still with her stuffed rabbit, the one Leah had given her at the beginning, the cruelest kind of irony, and stared at the ceiling. Miss Martha, Naomi said softly. Yes, baby. A long pause. Then, do you think Mama can still see me from heaven? Martha felt the tears come fast and hard, and she blinked them back with everything she had. She put her hand on Naomi's small forehead and smoothed back her hair and said in the steadiest voice she could find, I know she can. And I know she's proud of you. Every single day. Naomi closed her eyes. In 30 seconds she was asleep, the deep immediate sleep of a child who is completely exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from playing. The kind that comes from surviving. Martha sat there in the dark for a long time. Then she went home and opened her notes and typed for 40 minutes without stopping. The next morning she did something she had been turning over in her mind for 2 weeks. There was a woman on Naomi's street, Ruth. Solomon's older sister. She lived 4 blocks away and she had known Naomi since birth, and she came by every Sunday after church to drop food and check on things. Leah was always perfectly warm when Ruth came around. Perfectly gracious. Tea on the table, Naomi dressed nicely, everything arranged like a stage set. But Ruth was not fooled. Martha had seen it in her eyes for months, that careful, watchful look of a woman who loves someone and suspects something, but has no proof and no door to walk through. Martha knocked on Ruth's door at 7:30 on a Saturday morning with her phone in her hand and 3 weeks of documented evidence and a prayer on her lips. Ruth opened the door, took one look at Martha's face, and stepped aside to let her in without a single word. They sat at Ruth's kitchen table for 2 hours. Martha showed her everything. Every note. Every photograph. Every date and time and detail. Ruth read each one with the focused, white-knuckled attention of a woman holding herself together by sheer will. Halfway through she put her hand flat on the table and pressed down hard and stared at the wall. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright. When Martha finished, Ruth looked up and said, "Solomon cannot hear this from me. He will go into that house and do something that will destroy his life. We need someone whose hands are clean and whose words carry weight." She stood up. She walked to the drawer beside her refrigerator and opened it and searched through old papers with shaking hands until she found what she was looking for. A business card, slightly worn at the corners. She turned it over and read it once, like confirming something she already knew in her gut. "There is a lawyer," Ruth said slowly. "A man who handled my mother's estate years ago. A man who does not play games." She placed the card on the table. Martha leaned forward and read it. "Ezekiel Mensah, attorney at law. I'm calling him Monday morning," Ruth said. She did. And that Monday, in a quiet office downtown, a man in a dark suit listened to everything. He asked 3 questions. He wrote 2 things down. Then he closed his notepad, folded his hands, and looked at Ruth across the desk with the calm expression of a man who has seen many storms and has never once been swept away by one. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. Ruth didn't know what he was going to find in those 2 weeks. She didn't know that Leah Okonkwo had a story too, a buried one full of holes. And that Ezekiel Mensah was exactly the kind of man who pulled on threads until whole garments unraveled. She didn't know that what he found in those 2 weeks would not just end Leah's time in that house. It would end everything Leah had ever pretended to be. Ezekiel Mensah was not the kind of lawyer who rushed. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver locks pulled back neatly and a voice so deep and measured that people in courtrooms sometimes leaned forward just to make sure they were catching every word. He had practiced law for 34 years. He had seen fraud, deception, manipulation, cruelty dressed in kindness. He had seen all of it, in all its forms, wearing all its different masks. Very little surprised him anymore. But when his investigator, a quiet and thorough woman named Grace, placed a folder on his desk exactly 11 days after his meeting with Ruth, Ezekiel opened it, read the first page, and sat back in his chair very slowly. Then he read the whole thing. Every page. Without moving. Then he closed the folder, put both hands flat on his desk, and looked out the window at the Houston skyline for a long time. "Lord," he said quietly to nobody in the room. "This poor child." Because what Grace had found was not just a woman being cruel inside a marriage. What Grace had found was a woman who had never been who she said she was. Not for a single day of her life in Houston. Not one. Leah Okonkwo did not grow up in Abuja. She did not study in London. The hospitality consulting firm she claimed to work for had no record of her employment. Her LinkedIn profile, which looked so polished and complete, had been created 3 years ago, right around the time she arrived in Houston, and every credential listed on it was either exaggerated beyond recognition or completely fabricated from thin air. Her real name was Blessing Nwosu. She was from a small town in Imo State, Nigeria. She had come to the United States on a student visa in 2019, enrolled in a community college in Georgia for 1 semester, then quietly dropped out and disappeared from every official record. No deportation. No legal status adjustment. Just gone. The way people go when they have decided to build a new life in the cracks between official systems. She had become Leah Okonkwo through a combination of purchased documents and borrowed identity pieces that Grace described in the report as sophisticated enough to pass casual checks, but not a deep search. A real Leah Okonkwo existed, a woman in London who had no idea her name and date of birth had been borrowed and carried across an ocean. But here was the part that made Ezekiel press his hands flat on the desk. Here was the part that explained everything. The patience, the targeting, the careful entry into Solomon's life at exactly the right moment. Solomon Adeyemi was not chosen randomly. Grace had traced Leah's movements in Houston over the 8 months before she appeared at that business dinner. 8 months. During that time, she had attended 4 events connected to Houston's Nigerian professional community. She had made specific inquiries, through mutual social contacts, through church networks, through the kind of gentle information gathering that nobody notices because it looks like ordinary friendliness, about Solomon specifically. His income, his assets, his property, his status as a widower. The fact that he owned a home outright because Deborah, careful and forward-thinking even in her illness, had made sure the mortgage was settled before she died. Leah had known about the house before she ever walked into that dinner. She had known about his savings. She had known about the life insurance policy Solomon had taken out years ago that Deborah had insisted on. She had researched this man the way a hunter researches terrain before a hunt, quietly, completely, leaving nothing to chance. And then she had walked into that room in a beautiful dress and found him standing alone and said, "You look like a man carrying something heavy," and let him believe it was instinct. Let him believe she had simply noticed him. She had noticed him months before that night. She had simply waited for the right room to introduce herself. Ezekiel read all of this and felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel in professional settings. Fury. Clean, cold, quiet fury. The kind that doesn't shake your hands but sharpens your mind to a point. He thought about Naomi. 7 years old, eating from a dog's bowl, crying without sound on a cold kitchen floor. The daughter of a woman who had settled her mortgage before she died so her child would always have a home. That home, the one Deborah had made safe with deliberate love and careful planning, had been targeted. Walked into. Taken over by a woman who had spent 8 months preparing to steal it. He picked up his phone and called Ruth. "I need you to get Solomon home," he said. "Tonight if possible. Tomorrow at the absolute latest. Don't tell him everything. Tell him it's a family matter. Tell him it's important. Tell him Naomi needs him." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it as bad as I feared?" Ezekiel looked at the folder on his desk. "It's worse," he said simply. "But it ends now." Solomon landed in Houston on Thursday morning, a day earlier than planned. Ruth had called him Wednesday evening and said the words that no father can ignore. "Soul. Naomi needs you home." He hadn't asked questions. He had rebooked his flight before the call was over. He walked into Ruth's house at 9 in the morning and found her sitting at the kitchen table with Martha and a man he didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, silver locks, dark suit, a folder on the table in front of him, and the kind of stillness that serious men carry. Solomon looked at the 3 faces. Something dropped in his stomach. "Sit down, Solomon," Ruth said. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes were already red. "Please, sit down." Ezekiel did not ease into it. He had learned over 34 years that with men like Solomon, steady men, quiet men, men who have already survived the worst thing they could imagine, easing in is its own cruelty. So he opened the folder and he laid it out clearly, completely, with all the compassion he had and none of the softness that would have made it harder. He told Solomon about the dog's bowl. He watched Solomon's face go completely still. He told Solomon about the empty lunch bag. He watched Solomon's hand close into a fist on the table. He told Solomon about the bruises on Naomi's arms. He watched something break open in Solomon's eyes that was not tears yet. It was something older and more painful than tears. It was the look of a father realizing that his child was hurting, and he was the last to know, and the weight of that is not something that any amount of crying can fully carry. And then Ezekiel told him about Leah, about Blessing Nwosu, about Imo State in Georgia and the false documents and the 8 months of research, and the business dinner that was not a coincidence, about the house that Deborah had settled and protected, and how it had been the target from the very beginning. Solomon didn't make a sound. Not one. He sat at that table and listened to every word, and his face went through things that Martha, watching from across the table, would never be able to fully describe. grief and rage and shame and horror, and something so deep and private that it had no name. The feeling of a man who loved a woman enough to open his broken life to her, and discovering that she had been measuring the dimensions of that life before she ever walked through the door. When Ezekiel finished, the kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Solomon pushed back from the table. He stood up. He walked to Ruth's kitchen window and stood there looking out at the backyard where a bird was sitting on the fence doing nothing in particular. He stood there for a long time. Ruth stood up and put her hand on his back. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just put her hand there so he could feel that he was not alone. Finally, Solomon turned around. His eyes were red, but his voice, when it came, was quiet and controlled in the way of a man who has decided to feel everything later and act now. "Where is Naomi?" he asked. "At school," Martha said softly. "She's safe. She doesn't know you're back." Something moved across Solomon's face. Relief, so raw it was almost painful to witness. "Okay," he said. "Okay." He looked at Ezekiel. "What do we do?" Ezekiel opened the second half of the folder. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "I go to your house. You will not be there. I need you to not be there, because what I need to say to that woman needs to be said without a husband in the room who might feel the need to raise his voice before I've finished speaking." Solomon stared at him. "You're going alone?" "I'm going with documents," Ezekiel said simply. "In my experience, documents are louder than any voice in the room." That night, Solomon checked into a hotel 2 miles from his own house, so that Leah would not know he was back in Houston. Ruth picked Naomi up from school and brought her to her house for what she told Naomi was a special anti-sleepover. Naomi arrived with her backpack and her stuffed rabbit and the particular guarded expression she always wore now, that careful, watchful look she had learned since Leah arrived. But something happened that evening at Ruth's house that nobody had planned for. After dinner, after Ruth's children had gone to bed and the house had gotten quiet and warm, Naomi climbed into Ruth's lap the way she used to when she was very small, before her mother died, before all of it, and Ruth held her without saying anything, and Naomi pressed her face into her aunt's shoulder. And then slowly Naomi began to talk. She talked for 45 minutes. She talked about the bowl and the floor and the empty lunchbox and the words Leah said when Solomon wasn't home. "Your father will get tired of you one day. You know that, don't you? You're too much. You've always been too much." She talked about the bruises, how they happened, the grip, the warning that came with it. She said if I told Daddy, she would tell him that I was lying and that I was a bad child, and then he would send me away and I would have no one. She talked about her mother. She said, "I talk to Mama at night sometimes. I tell her what's happening. I don't know if she can hear me." Ruth was crying silently, completely, tears running down her face into Naomi's hair. She held this child tighter and said, "She hears you, baby. I promise you she hears every single word." Naomi pulled back and looked at Ruth with those enormous eyes. "Auntie Ruth," she said, "is it going to get better?" Ruth wiped her face. She cupped Naomi's cheeks in both hands the way Deborah used to. "Yes," she said, not gently, not carefully, but with the full force of a woman who knew what was happening the next morning and what it was going to change. "Yes. Starting tomorrow, everything gets better. I promise you that with everything I have." Naomi looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, slowly, solemnly, the way children accept promises when they have been hurt enough to know the difference between real ones and empty ones. Then she leaned back into Ruth's shoulder and closed her eyes. And in a hotel 2 miles away, Solomon sat on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled like nothing and stared at a photograph on his phone. Naomi at 5 years old, sitting on Deborah's lap, both of them laughing at something outside the frame, Deborah's arms wrapped all the way around her, the cinnamon candle burning on the table behind them, everything golden. He stared at it for a very long time. Then he typed a message to Ezekiel. 4 words. "Make sure she hears everything." Ezekiel read it at 10:47 at night from his desk where he was still working, still preparing, still sharpening every word he would walk into that house and say in the morning. He typed back 2 words. "She will." Leah woke up on Friday morning and made herself coffee and sat at her dining table. The same chair, the same unbothered ease of a woman who believes she is safe. She didn't know that Solomon was back in Houston. She didn't know about Grace's folder. She didn't know about Martha's notes or Ruth's kitchen table or 45 minutes of a little girl telling the truth. She sat there with her coffee and her phone and the quiet comfort of a house she believed was hers. The doorbell rang at 10 a.m. She opened the door and saw a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. Silver locks. Reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket. A briefcase in one hand and a folder so thick it needed both sides of the clasp to hold it shut. She had never seen this man before in her life. But something in her stomach moved. Something old and instinctive and afraid. "Mrs. Adeyemi," he said, and his voice was the kind that arrived before it needed to be loud. "My name is Ezekiel Mensah. I'm an attorney, and I think you already know why I'm here." Leah gripped the door. She did not know everything yet, but she knew enough. She knew from the folder. She knew from the way he looked at her, not with anger, not with judgment, but with the specific, terrifying calm of a man who has already won and is simply arriving to let you know. "May I come in?" he said. She stepped back. She let him in, and the door closed behind him. "Can you feel it?" Solomon in that hotel room staring at Deborah's photograph. Naomi finally talking after all those months of silence. And now Ezekiel Mensah standing in that living room with a folder full of truth and nowhere for Leah to run. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. Leah sat on the couch with her hands in her lap and her coffee going cold on the table beside her. Ezekiel sat across from her in the armchair. He did not open the folder immediately. He set it on the coffee table between them and let it sit there, thick, heavy, closed, and let her look at it. Because he had learned something in 34 years of law that no textbook ever taught him. The moment before a person knows everything is often more powerful than the moment they find out. Let them sit with what they imagine is inside. Let their own conscience fill in the pages. Leah was very good at controlling her face. Ezekiel could see her working at it. The deliberate settling of her expression into something between confusion and mild irritation. The performance of a woman who has no idea what this could possibly be about. She had done this before. She was practiced at it. She crossed her legs and tilted her chin slightly and said, with exactly the right amount of polite impatience, "I'm sorry, did my husband send you? Because if there's a legal matter, Solomon and I handle things together. I'd prefer he be present for whatever this is." Ezekiel looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "Blessing." One word. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Leah's composure didn't shatter. She was too controlled for that. But it cracked. Just at the edges. Just enough. Her chin came down a fraction. Her fingers, which had been resting loosely in her lap, pressed together. "I beg your pardon," she said. "I think you heard me," Ezekiel said. He opened the folder. He did not rush. That was the thing about Ezekiel Mensah. He never rushed. He laid the documents out one at a time on the coffee table with the patience of a man laying tiles, each one deliberate, each one placed exactly where it needed to be. The first was Grace's background report. He turned it to face Leah and slid it forward. Blessing Adiz Nwosu. Born 1990 in Imo State, Nigeria. Student visa issued 2019 Georgia. Community college enrollment, 1 semester. Visa expiration, no renewal on record. Leah looked at the document. She said nothing. "The woman currently sitting in front of me," Ezekiel continued, "has no legal right to be in this country under the name Leah Okonkwo. Because Leah Okonkwo is a real woman living in London who has never set foot in Texas and who has a police report filed in her name regarding identity theft. A report, I should mention, that I personally helped bring to the attention of the relevant authorities this past Monday morning." The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "The marriage certificate filed in Harris County," Ezekiel said, placing the next document down, "bears a false identity, which means the marriage itself, in the eyes of the law, is not a marriage. Solomon Adeyemi did not marry you. He cannot have married you, because you do not legally exist." Leah's jaw tightened. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled, barely, but still. "You don't know what you're talking about. I have documents." "I have purchased documents," Ezekiel said simply. "I know. I have the source." He let that land. Then he placed the next page down. Martha's log. 41 pages of dates, times, descriptions, typed, printed, signed at the bottom by Martha herself with a date and a witness signature from a notary public, because Martha had gone to a notary 3 weeks ago without telling anyone and made every page official. Made every page something that would stand up in a room where it mattered. 41 pages, Ezekiel said, covering a period of 3 months. Written by a woman who was in this house multiple times each week, who saw things she wrote down immediately in real time with timestamps. He watched Leah's eyes move across the first page. He watched her read her own behavior documented in plain, simple language. The bowl, the floor, the cold rice, the empty lunchbox, the grip on a 7-year-old child's arm that left 4 oval bruises on soft skin. He watched her read it, and he watched something shift behind her eyes. Not remorse. He knew better than to expect remorse from someone like this. It was something colder than remorse. It was calculation. She was still trying to find the angle. Still looking for the exit. This is one person's word, Leah said. One disgruntled employee who. Ezekiel placed the next document down. Ruth's signed statement. 5 pages. Then the school nurse's report. Unexplained weight loss. Notes of concern filed over a 2-month period. Photographs from the nurse's records of Naomi's declining physical condition. Then the photographs Martha had taken. The bowl close up. Rex still legible in the glaze. The empty lunch bag open, nothing inside. Then the last document. Ezekiel placed this one down more slowly than the others. He smoothed it flat with his palm. It was a child's drawing. Naomi's. Found by Martha in the small space between Naomi's mattress and the wall when she was changing the bedding 3 weeks ago. A pencil drawing, a little girl alone on a floor with a bowl in front of her. Stick figures, the way 7-year-olds draw. But the detail was unmistakable. The bowl. The floor. And above the little figure, a second figure, floating, with wings, arms stretched downward toward the child below. The mother, watching from heaven. Martha had photographed it and put it back exactly where she found it so Naomi would not know it had been seen. Ezekiel heard Leah pull in a sharp breath when she saw it. He didn't look up from the document. He gave her a moment. Then he folded his hands and he looked at her directly, and he spoke in a voice that was quiet and final and carried the full weight of everything in that folder. You came into this house with a false name and a plan. You targeted a widower. You researched his assets, his property, his grief. You walked into his life at his lowest moment, and you used his love for his daughter as the door. And then, and this is the part one needs you to really hear, you took a child who had already lost her mother. A child who was already broken open with grief. And you put her on the floor of her own kitchen and fed her from a dead dog's bowl and told her that her father didn't want her. He paused. That child's name is Naomi. She is 7 years old. Her mother spent the last months of her life making sure that she would be safe. And you looked at that child, that specific child, and you chose cruelty. Every single day you chose it. The room was absolutely still. Leah's eyes were bright now, but not with remorse. With fear. The particular glassy fear of a person watching the walls close in from every direction simultaneously and finding no gap to slide through. What do you want? She said. Her voice had lost its smoothness. Just slightly. Just enough. I don't want anything, Ezekiel said. I represent Solomon Adeyemi. And what Mr. Adeyemi wants is very simple. He reached into his briefcase and produced a single sheet of paper. Clean. Formal. He placed it on top of everything else. You will vacate this property within 48 hours. You will take personal clothing and nothing else. Not furniture, not electronics, not the car purchased under Solomon's name, not a single item from this house beyond what you brought to it, which, since you arrived with a fabricated identity and manufactured history, amounts to very little. Immigration and Customs Enforcement has been notified of your status and will be in contact. The Harris County District Attorney's Office has received a copy of this file regarding the fraudulent marriage certificate, and Child Protective Services has been provided with Martha's documentation regarding Naomi. He stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at Leah one final time. The law is going to be very busy with you in the coming months, he said. I suggest you spend the next 48 hours doing exactly one thing, packing. He picked up his briefcase. He walked to the front door. His hand was on the handle when Leah's voice came from behind him. Smaller now, stripped of everything, barely a voice at all. I did love him. Ezekiel stopped. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned his head just slightly, not fully, just enough. Then you should have come to him as yourself, he said. He was worth that. She was worth that. He opened the door and walked out into the morning sunlight. Solomon was parked 2 streets away, engine off, phone in his hand. When Ezekiel's name lit up the screen, he answered before the first ring finished. It's done, Ezekiel said. Solomon closed his eyes. He pressed his phone against his forehead and sat like that in the quiet car and breathed. Just breathed. In and out. The way a man breathes when something enormous has been lifted from a place so deep inside him that he didn't even know how much he'd been holding until it was gone. Then he started the engine. He drove to Ruth's house. He parked outside and walked up the path and knocked twice, and Ruth opened the door and looked at his face and stepped aside. Naomi was at the kitchen table drawing. She had a red crayon in her hand, and her tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth the way she always did when she was concentrating hard on getting something exactly right. She was drawing a butterfly. Her first one in months. Ruth had noticed it and said nothing. Just put the paper in front of her and let it happen. She heard the door and looked up. When she saw her father standing in the doorway, she went completely still for 1 second. That one suspended second where the body hasn't caught up with what the eyes are seeing. And then she was across the kitchen so fast that the red crayon rolled off the table and fell to the floor, and nobody picked it up. Solomon caught her. He dropped to his knees right there in Ruth's kitchen and caught his daughter and held her so tightly and so completely that she disappeared into his arms. Her small legs wrapped around him. Her fingers grabbed fistfuls of his shirt. "Daddy." Her voice was muffled against his shoulder. "Daddy, you came back." "I never left you," he said. His voice broke completely on the last word, and he didn't try to fix it. "Baby, I never left you. I'm so sorry. Daddy's so sorry. I'm here. I'm right here." They stayed on that floor for a long time. Ruth stood in the doorway of her own kitchen with her hand over her mouth. Martha, who had come that morning without being asked, because some things you simply show up for, stood beside her. Neither of them said a word. Some moments do not need commentary. Some moments just need witnesses. Leah was gone by the next morning. She left before the 48 hours were up, which told Ezekiel everything he needed to know about how much she understood the weight of what was in that folder. She took 2 bags. She left no note. The dining table was wiped clean. The wine glass was washed and placed back in the cabinet. Even in leaving, she was controlled, careful, performing neatness as though it could undo something. She left the dog's bowl. It was still on the kitchen floor. When Solomon came home and walked into the kitchen and saw it sitting there, Rex, chipped at the rim, faded and ugly and impossible to look at, he picked it up. He held it in both hands for a moment and looked at it and felt everything it represented. Every night his daughter had spent on that floor. Every silent tear dropped into cold rice. Every time Naomi had talked to her mother in the dark, because there was no one living she trusted enough to tell. He walked to the back door and he opened it and he put the bowl in the trash. He pressed the lid down. He stood at the back door and looked out at the yard. The same yard where Naomi used to play when Deborah was alive. The little garden Deborah had planted along the fence that had gone overgrown now but was still there, still alive at the roots. Then he went back inside and he called Naomi's name, and she came padding into the kitchen in her socks with the stuffed rabbit under her arm, and she looked at him, and then at the floor where the bowl used to be, and something moved across her face. Relief so deep and full that it looked almost like grief passing through on its way out. "It's gone," she said. "It's gone," Solomon said. "And it's never coming back." Naomi looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the kitchen table and climbed into her chair and picked up her red crayon from where Ruth had slipped it into her pocket and brought it back. She put a fresh piece of paper in front of her. She pressed the crayon down. She began to draw a butterfly. Solomon sat across from her and watched her draw. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, present and still, watching his daughter fill the page with color. After a while she looked up and smiled at him. A real smile. The first full real smile he had seen on her face in longer than he could remember. Deborah's smile, all the way to the edges. "Daddy," she said. "Yes, baby. I told Mama last night that things were going to get better." She looked back down at her drawing. I think she already knew. Solomon looked at his daughter, 8 years old now, thin but healing, bruises fading, drawing butterflies in her mother's kitchen with a red crayon on a Friday morning while the sun came through the window and landed right on her. And he did not trust himself to speak for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, gently, the way you hold something you almost lost. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think she did too." Outside, the garden Deborah had planted along the fence stirred gently in the morning wind. Still alive at the roots. Still growing toward the light. Some things cannot be taken. Some things, no matter what tries to bury them, keep coming back. Naomi pressed her crayon to the paper and drew the butterfly's wings wide open. Wider than any she had drawn before. Like something that had been folded up for a very long time and was finally free. If Naomi found a piece of your heart and took it home with her, if Solomon on that kitchen floor made you feel something you didn't expect, then you know exactly why stories like this matter. They remind us that cruelty never gets the last word, that the children who suffer in silence are not forgotten, that somewhere someone is always watching, always writing, always waiting to knock on the door. For Martha, who wrote every page. For Ruth, who showed up. For Ezekiel, who never rushed. And for every Naomi, still on the floor, still waiting, still talking to their mother in the dark. Help is coming. It always comes. Subscribe to this channel to support our growth. Share this story with someone who needs to feel something real today. And remember, the children who can't speak for themselves need people around them who will. Naomi got hers. That's everything.